Let's look at some basic brain anatomy here. Brain, something that a lot of you have. Others I'm not quite so sure. It's just a joke. Relax. Okay, major divisions of the brain. There are lots of ways to divide up the brain. You can divide it up in terms of its development, in terms of its function, and so on. This is one way, and it's a convenient way for us, I think. All right. So, brainstem. Brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The brainstem is sort of, in evolutionary terms, it's the oldest. It's the most primitive part of the brain. Brainstem controls basic survival level functions, heartbeat, breathing, things like vomiting, coughing, stuff that's, just at a very basic level trying to keep you alive. That's the brainstem, right? Even the most primitive of animals have brainstem. Let's go on next to Diencephalon. The Diencephalon is a way, in evolutionary terms, it's like an outgrowth of the brainstem. It's on top of the brainstem. So follow along on the diagram. You can see Diencephalon. Diencephalon consists of a variety of structures. The ones that we're going to kind of focus on are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pineal, and the pituitary. Those are pretty important parts of the brain, all right? So in a sense, they're an intermediate part of the brain in between the brainstem and sort of the most evolved and advanced part of the brain, which is the cerebrum. Normally when you look at a brain, you're seeing a lot of cerebrum. All that pink wrinkly stuff, that's cerebrum. Cerebrum in evolutionary terms is the most recently developed part of the brain. This is where thinking, reasoning, problem solving, emotions, memory, learning, that's taking place up in your cerebrum. And then notice the cerebellum is this special little part of the brain that kind of hangs off the backside. The cerebellum is really interesting. It does a lot of interesting things that are related to posture and balance and coordinating movements. So if you think of the cerebellum as being sort of a movement-related part of the brain, you're not too far off. Other parts of the brain have to do with movement as well. But the cerebellum is kind of the place where the coordination, the sequencing takes place. Here, an actual brain, this is a big shock sometimes to medical students, surgeons, they get into their first operation, they go, oh my God, it's not color-coded? I don't know what to do. No, of course, that's ridiculous. But there you can see all the stuff we just talked about, it's right there, okay? So let's, at the very superficial level, let's start up with the cerebrum and start looking at the lobes, the fissures, the sulci, and the gyri. So a sulcus, the word means groove. A fissure is a big sulcus. So a fissure is a really big groove, all right? A gyrus, so by the way, sulcus is singular, sulci, plural. Pronounce it any way you want. I don't care, but that's the way it's spelled. Sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. And then gyri. Gyrus is this, it's not a Greek thing here with lamb. Gyrus means a ridge. It's one of the bumps, all right? Singular gyrus, plural gyri, all right? So when you look at the brain, either illustration, all the little bumps, all the little ridges, those are the gyri. And all of the little grooves and slits and stuff like that, those are the sulci and the fissures, okay? So the central sulcus divides the left and the right halves of the brain. On the skull, we have the longitudinal fissure, all right? So this is right on top of that. Divides the cerebrum into left and right halves. Now, notice, so here let's talk about lobes for a minute, even though it's not in this PowerPoint exactly. What they've colored red there is the frontal lobe. And the sort of azure, the sort of sky blue color, that is the parietal lobe. How do you suppose they got their names? Yeah, frontal lobe is right underneath the frontal bone, parietal lobe right underneath the parietal bone. So, by the way, I just totally mixed things up. I was thinking about one thing, talking about something else. Central sulcus, go back, erase everything I said about that. Longitudinal fissure is what I was talking about. I was talking about the sagittal suture on the skull, and the longitudinal fissure follows the sagittal suture, all right? Sorry, I'm kind of doing more than one thing at once here. So The central sulcus is actually the dividing line between the frontal and the parietal lobe. So you can see right there, it's got it labeled central sulcus. Now notice the ridge in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. Pre because it's in front of. Whereas the ridge behind the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus. As we're going to see, this is a big deal. The precentral gyrus is where motor commands issue from, and the postcentral gyrus is where sensory information comes in. In fact, we're going to call the precentral gyrus the motor cortex, and we're going to call the postcentral gyrus the sensory cortex. So thank goodness we got that cleared up. You can see the central sulcus, the precentral and postcentral gyri. Then the lateral cerebral sulcus, this separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe right underneath your temporal bone. So you can see it there, lateral cerebral sulcus. The temporal lobes look kind of like ear flaps on a hat. So that lateral cerebral sulcus is what separates the ear flaps from the rest of the hat. All right? The transverse fissure is what separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. The transverse fissure. The parieto-occipital sulcus, boy, could anything be more accurately named than that? It separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. All right? Then the longitudinal fissure, what I was talking nonsense about early on, that's the one that separates, you can see in the lower right image, that separates the left and right halves of the brain, the longitudinal fissure, all right? Runs right over the sagittal suture on the skull. And then insula. So in the upper left, see how there's some cerebrum that's not in plain view, it's hidden underneath? That's called insula. Root word like insulated, it's down underneath. So notice there's some insula kind of behind part of the frontal lobe, a little bit behind some of the parietal lobe, and a little bit behind some of the temporal lobe. It's insulated, it's insula, all right? That's deeper down underneath the more superficial cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebellum. We looked at the cerebrum. Let's look at the cerebellum. Upper right diagram, you can see it kind of hangs off the back side of the brainstem. We're only looking at half of the cerebellum there. When we lay it out in the lower left, you can see then both hemispheres of the cerebellum. Now notice in the lower left, see how the two hemispheres are joined together by a thing that looks kind of like a little worm? Well, yeah, that's the vermis. Root word verm is worm. So see the worm? Can you see it? That's basically the joiner. It's like a zipper. It's like a connector that connects the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Then the cerebellar peduncles, you can see in the upper right, that's where the cerebellum attaches to the brainstem. All right? The cerebellum and the brainstem have to communicate with one another, and so they connect at the cerebellar peduncles. Then the arbor vitae. All right? So arbor vitae, arbor means tree, and vitae means life. So the arbor vitae is the tree of life. Just one of those, people in the Renaissance and Middle Ages were drunk all the time. They were always giving weird names to things. But in the upper right, you can see there, see how it looks kind of like a tree? There's that white area in the middle of the cerebellum. It's got branches coming out. That's the arbor vitae, the tree of life. Now, ventricles are sacs of cerebrospinal fluid. There are 4 ventricles in the brain. There are the 2 lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle. So notice, in between the cerebellum and the brainstem in the upper right-hand illustration, you can see the 4th ventricle, all right? And then within the 4th ventricle, you can see where it says choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is the tissue full of ependymal cells. Remember, ependymal cells are the glial cells that make cerebrospinal fluid. So the choroid plexus is where cerebrospinal fluid is being manufactured, right there inside of the ventricle. And then just pointing out that the medulla oblongata is down below the cerebellum. The cerebellum is basically right across from the pons on the brainstem. So if you, in the upper right-hand illustration, you see the cerebellum. If you go to the left, then you see the pons sticking out. That's a good way to, those are landmarks on the brainstem. So let's look at the brainstem itself. The medulla oblongata, see down there at the bottom, this is the survival reflex center of the brain. This is controlling heart rate, breathing, and things like vomiting and coughing and sneezing. You might think, whoa, those are survival reflexes? Yeah, they are. If you ate something that's poisonous, you got to get it out of your stomach. That's vomiting. And if something is blocking your airways, you need to get it out of there. That's what sneezing and coughing are ultimately for, okay? Then notice the pons. Pons, the same root word is like pontoon, like a pontoon boat, a pontoon bridge. It means the connector. All right, it means a bridge. All right, it's ultimately the root word bridge. So the pons is the bridge between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So you can see there on the brainstem where the pons is. The pons is very important for regulating breathing. It kind of sets the respiratory rate and modifies the respiratory rate. It has a huge role in that. The cerebral peduncles, don't mix these up with the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebral peduncles are where the cerebrum connects to the brainstem. The cerebellar peduncles were where the cerebellum connected to the brainstem. The cerebral peduncles, again, where the cerebrum attaches to the brainstem. Then you can see the superior and inferior colliculi. Singular colliculus, but there's one on each side, so there are two. There are two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. The four together are called the quadrigeminal bodies, quad 4. They control things like visual and auditory tracking and reflexes. Superior colliculus is for visual tracking and reflexes. Inferior colliculus is auditory tracking and reflexes. Mammillary bodies, you can see them on the front. There's two of them, and if you look from a certain view, we'll see coming up, they basically look like the brain boobs. That's why they're called mammillary bodies. Mammillary, like a breast. They're part of the limbic system, which we'll talk about later. They're connecting things like smells and emotions and memories. In the cerebellum now, you can really see the arbor vitae in this slide. And the diencephalon on the back side, on the posterior side of the brainstem, you see the pineal. Pineal secretes melatonin and serotonin, important in regulating things like sleep and perhaps the onset of puberty and things like that. Once again, the cerebral, the fourth ventricle, let's do that first. Fourth ventricle is in between the pons and the brainstem. Now, below the fourth ventricle, we have the central canal of the spinal cord, which is full of cerebrospinal fluid. Once it hits the fourth ventricle, once it goes above that, it now changes names. We now call it the cerebral aqueduct. In the illustration, you can see they call it the aqueduct of the midbrain, or cerebral aqueduct. You know, like here in Tucson, you're driving on Grant, you haven't made any turns, and suddenly the sign says you're on Kolb, you're going like, WTF? You know, you're driving on Ina, and suddenly the sign says you're on Skyline, and you haven't made any turns. It's like that. It's the same damn tube. It's just below the fourth ventricle. It's called the central canal of the spinal cord. Once we go above the fourth ventricle, the same damn tube is called the cerebral aqueduct. All right? Now, looking at a few structures here, the olfactory bulbs. These sit on top of the cribriform plate, and this is where odors hit. The olfactory bulbs is where the processing of smell begins, and then the olfactory tract carries that information to the brain, where you go, damn, that's a cherry pie. Give me a slice of that with some ice cream. All right, and then the pituitary, we've seen before. Pituitary hangs down from the hypothalamus. Pituitary is the master gland of the endocrine system. All right, it's controlled by the hypothalamus. Mammillary bodies, again, we see part of the limbic system. Cerebral peduncle, you can see those kind of hanging down. The pons, you see bulging out. The pyramids. So notice in the brainstem there, where the medulla oblongata is, there are raised up bumps. Those are the pyramids. That's where the descending motor tracts cross. We call it the decussation of the pyramids. And because they cross over one another, that makes it extra wide, and that's why they're raised up like that. Those are those raised ridges there on the brainstem. And then the olives, which don't show up well in this picture at all, are olive-shaped bodies that are down there in the same region. Well, we'll see a better picture coming up, I hope. So the olives have to do with proprioceptive information, basically knowing where your body is in space. I mean, think about it. When you're driving your car and you need to step on the brake, do you need to look down to see where the brake pedal is? If you do, I hope you're not driving on any of the same roads I drive on. Normally we know where the brake pedal is, we know where our foot is, and without looking, we simply lift up our foot and step on the brake. That's proprioception, basically. Olives deal in interpretation of some of that information. Now, the dura mater folds down into the longitudinal fissure and lines both sides of it. Therefore, it creates a membrane that goes down into the cerebrum. That's called the falx cerebri. There's the same sort of thing that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. In fact, it makes like a little tent over the cerebellum, so we call it the tentorium cerebelli. And then the falx cerebelli is just like the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri, or falx cerebri, people say both ways, those, that's the dura mater that's separating the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. The falx cerebelli is the dura mater that separates the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. And then the superior sagittal sinus is a sinus we see a lot in Bio 202. It's usually a big vein. There are lots of meanings for the word sinus, all right? In this case, specifically with blood vessels, a sinus is a big vein, and it runs right down in the longitudinal fissure. This is where you recycle cerebrospinal fluid, so it's kind of a big deal. There's also the inferior sagittal sinus, which you can see in this diagram underneath. I make you learn that in Bio 202, in Bio 202, but not in Bio 201. So here you see what I was talking about before. If you look at the illustration on the right, there's the superior sagittal sinus. It's full of blood, all right? And then you can see there's something called an arachnoid villus, singular villus, plural villi. So the arachnoid villi are sticking up. They are actually originating in the subarachnoid space. That's why they're called arachnoid villi. And they are basically recycling. Remember, the subarachnoid space was full of CSF. They are recycling that CSF into the superior sagittal sinus, all right? So that's how we recycle our CSF. It's through the arachnoid villi going into the superior sagittal sinus. Lateral ventricles, you can see a little bit in the lower left diagram, those two little V-like things. We'll see better views of those. One of the hard things about the brain is that you have to take views from many different perspectives and sort of put them together in 3D inside of your head. It's difficult to do. I'm telling you, it takes a little bit of time and practice. So try to work on that. You can again see in the lateral ventricles there's choroid plexus where CSF is being made. And then the cerebral aqueduct you can see on the left, that's connecting the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, all right? And we haven't really seen the third ventricle yet. I think that's coming up. So again, on the lower right, you see dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, septum pellucidum. So in between the two lateral ventricles, if you look in the lower left diagram, there's a thin little membrane there that keeps the fluid in the two lateral ventricles separate. That's called the septum pellucidum. Septum means a divider. Lucid means clear. It's the clear divider. So we see lots of septums in the human body. The nasal septum separated your left and right nostrils. So here we have the septum pellucidum, which separates the two lateral ventricles. So now we see a full-on view of the ventricles, a sagittal view and a frontal or coronal view. So in the top you see the frontal coronal view. We have these big horns, all right? The lateral ventricles are these two big structures, and you can see them in the lower as well. There's one on the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. Again, they're separated by the septum pellucidum, and you can see it shows that in the upper diagram. See septum pellucidum, a little thin divider between the two lateral ventricles. You don't have to know all the horns of the ventricle. I don't make you learn those. Notice then in the lower part of the diagram, the third ventricle. So the two lateral ventricles, they communicate with the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen. You can see that in the lower diagram. So cerebrospinal fluid circulates all through the brain, so it flows from one place to another. Kind of like in Minnesota, there's the land of 10,000 lakes. A lot of the lakes connect to one another. In high school, you used to go up there and go canoeing, and you could get in your canoe and you go from one lake to another lake to another lake, because the lakes all just connected together. That's kind of like the ventricles. They all connect to one another. So the lateral ventricles connect to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen. The third ventricle you see there, it's got a hole in the middle, all right? That hole in the middle is for the intermediate mass of the thalamus, which we'll see coming up. That's an easy way to remember where the thalamus is on this diagram. The third ventricle is in between the two halves of the thalamus. Then notice from the third ventricle we have the cerebral aqueduct running down to the fourth ventricle, all right? And again, you don't have to know all the different, you don't have to know lateral aperture and all that stuff, just the fourth ventricle. Okay, so another view here of the ventricles. You can see them not very well, but choroid plexus they're showing there of the third ventricle. Yeah, that's it's hard to find good diagrams of the brain that show everything all at once. So mostly these would be for your reference when you're doing labs. Come back to this diagram and use it as much as you can to help you figure stuff out. Okay, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Just come back and study it when you need to. Corpus callosum, I see there's a term I didn't talk about before. Corpus callosum is a big band of myelinated fibers of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. I think that's coming up in another slide. I certainly hope. So here you see just, we've talked about a little bit about this before. The subarachnoid space, superior sagittal sinus, arachnoid villi, dura mater, falx cerebri, and so on. Subdural hematoma. So here you see the meninges, all right, and the spaces. Subdural hematoma, bleeding into the subdural space. It's most common of all the cranial hematomas. Mortality 60 to 80% if acute. Once again, when you start bleeding into these spaces in the brain, the intracranial pressure builds up, and that's very dangerous. That's going to get you. And then the epidural hematoma, bleeding into the epidural space. You often have a lucid interval followed by a loss of consciousness. This is why these head injuries are so dangerous. People seem like they're doing just fine, and then they pass out and they don't wake up again. Mortality 15 to 20%. Dr. Richard Atkins, the Atkins diet, that was one of the first keto diets. Gary Coleman, what you talking about with us? And Natasha Richardson, Liam Neeson's wife. There you go, Dr. Atkins, Gary Coleman, Natasha Richardson, and Mr. Tough Guy there, Liam Neeson.